Ilara was a creature of rust and solitude. Her sanctuary wasn't a sun-drenched beach or a bustling city park, but the deep, quiet heart of the old-growth forest that hugged the outskirts of her small New England town. She was a restorer, a mechanic who believed that every machine had a soul, a story whispered in the grain of its rusted metal and the clatter of its worn gears. She specialized in forgotten things, in pulling them back from the brink of decay and giving them a second chance at life. Her current project, a 1950s farm tractor, was nearing completion, and the familiar itch for a new challenge had begun to stir within her. Her fascination with forgotten machinery dated back to her childhood. She had grown up on a farm, and her grandfather had been a master of making do, of fixing what others considered broken beyond repair. He'd taught her the smell of good oil, the satisfying clack of a well-seated wrench, and the quiet triumph of bringing a seized engine back to life. After he passed, his old, cluttered barn became her workshop, a living monument to his memory. The machines she worked on were more than just metal and bolts. They were extensions of his philosophy, a way of honoring the past by giving it a future. She often found herself talking to the machines as she worked, a habit she'd picked up from him. "Don't you worry, old friend," she'd murmur to a rusted engine block. "We'll get you humming again." It was on one of her foraging trips, a search for forgotten homesteads and discarded machinery, that she found it. She was off the beaten path, following a barely there deer trail that led deeper into the woods than she had ever gone. The canopy overhead was so thick it filtered the sunlight into a cool, dappled green light. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a living perfume that she breathed in deeply. And then, she saw it, not a tractor, not a car, but something immense and angular, a ghost of olive drab against the gray bark of the trees. It was a monument to time and decay, a colossal hulk of steel and rust, draped in moss and ivy. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure exhilaration through her. A large oak had grown up through its front fender, its trunk now a permanent part of the machine's anatomy, a testament to decades of silent dormancy. It was a military truck, a deuce and a half, specifically an M35. The hood was gone, and the engine bay was a hollowed-out cavern filled with moss and nesting squirrels. The tires were flat, rotted husks, and the canvas cab top had long since disintegrated. The cargo bed was a swamp of dead leaves and stagnant rainwater. A sense of awe and reverence washed over Ilara. This was no ordinary find. This was a piece of history, an iron beast that had once thundered across foreign lands, now a quiet monument to time and decay. She walked around it slowly, her fingers tracing the faded stenciled letters on the side U.S. Army. The faint smell of oil and old canvas seemed to linger in the air, a phantom scent from a forgotten war. This was her next project, her most ambitious one yet. She didn't choose it, it chose her. The first step was the hardest: extraction. It took her 3 days of back-breaking work with a winch, a chainsaw, and a lot of cursing to free the truck from the tree that had claimed it. She'd tried everything: able winches, hydraulic jacks, even a small lever system she'd rigged from old railroad ties, but the tree held fast. The oak was old, its roots a stubborn web around the axles. She had to cut the tree down, section by section, a painstaking process that left her hands raw and her shoulders aching. Each scrape of metal against rock felt like a protest from the past. Finally, with a series of pulleys and a grunt of triumph, she dragged the chassis free. Once free, she loaded it onto a flatbed trailer she had built herself and hauled the skeletal remains back to her workshop. A large, drafty barn on the edge of her property. Inside the barn, surrounded by her tools and the familiar smell of grease and sawdust, the truck was an even more imposing presence. It was stripped bare, a skeleton waiting for flesh. Ilara began her work with the reverence of an archaeologist. She started with the engine bay. The original engine was a lost cause, a solid block of rust and organic matter. She knew she'd have to find a replacement. She spent weeks online, poring over military surplus sites and forum threads. She found a decommissioned LDT-465 multi-fuel diesel engine in a junkyard in North Carolina. It was a perfect match. The sourcing of parts became a pilgrimage, a treasure hunt across the country. She found a canvas top from a collector in Ohio, a set of replacement wheels and tires in a dusty shop in California, and a complete set of dash gauges from a veteran who had kept them for years, hoping one day he'd find the right project. The bodywork was a tedious, grueling process. She used a wire brush and a sandblaster to strip away decades of rust and rot, revealing the pockmarked, scarred steel beneath. Each ding and dent was a new puzzle, a story waiting to be told. She imagined the truck's life, the rough terrain it had crossed, the men who had ridden in its cab. She found a small, faded star stenciled on the door and carefully preserved it, painting around it so it would always be a part of the truck's new life. As she worked, she felt less like a restorer and more like a curator, preserving a piece of American history. She spent days meticulously repairing small imperfections, patching holes and straightening warped panels. The work was slow, painstaking, and utterly absorbing. She lost track of time, emerging from the barn only when her stomach grumbled with hunger or the moon was high in the sky. The painting was a turning point. She used a period-correct olive drab paint, the same kind the truck would have worn fresh from the factory. As the first coat went on, the old iron monster began to transform. The rusted skeleton disappeared, replaced by the clean, powerful lines of a military machine. It felt like she was breathing life back into it, watching a ghost take on solid form. She cleaned and polished the remaining chrome, a small detail that felt significant, like a wink from the past. She reupholstered the seats with new canvas, the rough, sturdy material, a faithful reproduction of the original. Finally, the engine arrived. It was a beautiful, greasy beast of an engine, and Ilara spent days meticulously installing it. The moment of truth came on a crisp autumn afternoon. She filled the fuel tank, checked the fluids, and climbed into the driver's seat. The gauges, now clean and functional, seemed to wink at her. She turned the key. There was a moment of silence, and then, with a deep, throaty cough, the diesel engine roared to life. A cloud of black smoke billowed from the exhaust pipe, and the truck trembled beneath her, alive once more. She laughed out loud, a sound of pure joy and triumph. The exhaust note was a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. The truck, now fully restored, was a magnificent sight. It sat gleaming in the sun, a perfect blend of power and history. The olive drab paint was flawless, the canvas top pristine, and the tires stood tall and proud. The small faded star on the door was the only reminder of its past life. Ilara felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering curiosity. Who had driven this truck? What was its story? The answer came to her one morning, a few weeks after she had finished the project. She had left the truck parked outside, the rear gate unlatched to air out the interior. A car, an old beat-up sedan, pulled up her driveway, its engine rattling. A man got out, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his posture a little stooped. He walked slowly toward the truck, his hands trembling. Ilara came out of the barn, wiping grease from her hands. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft. The man didn't respond. He just stared at the truck, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if seeing a ghost. He reached out a gnarled hand and touched the fender, his fingers tracing the familiar lines. Is this a deuce and a half?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It is," Ilara said. "I found it in the woods. I just finished restoring it." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the truck. He moved to the back, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped at the rear gate and reached inside the cargo bed. Ilara watched, confused. He ran his hand over the interior of the metal bed. Then he paused, his fingers stopping at a specific spot. He knelt down, his hand still on the spot. "Do you know why I'm here?" he asked, his voice breaking. "No, sir," she said. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I left my wedding ring in the cab," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost it during an operation in Vietnam. I was a driver for a supply unit. We were pinned down, and I had to get out and move quickly. My hand was covered in mud. The ring was a little loose. I remember looking for it when the danger had passed. I thought it had fallen off and was gone forever." Ilara's heart ached. The thought of all that history, that pain, that memory, was overwhelming. She knelt down beside him. "This truck, ... This truck was the last thing my best friend, Mike, ever saw," he said, his voice shaking. "We were in it together. He was hit. He died right there, in the back of this truck. We were carrying medical supplies. I've never forgotten. I've been coming out here for years, just walking the perimeter of these woods, hoping to find it. I lost track of where it was years ago, but I never gave up hope. I just wanted to see it one last time." He looked at the small, faded star on the door and smiled sadly. "That's our unit star," he said. "Mike stenciled it on a few weeks before he was gone." Ilara felt the weight of her work, the gravity of what she had done. She didn't just restore a truck. She restored a memory. She stood up and extended her hand to the veteran. "My name is Ilara," she said. "What's yours, Silas?" he said, taking her hand. He finally let the tears fall, a torrent of grief and relief that had been dammed up for decades. "Thank you, you brought him back to me." Ilara didn't know what to say. The magnitude of his words, of his story, was staggering. She didn't offer to sell him the truck. She knew, in that moment, that this truck was no longer just a project. It was a monument to a friendship, a living memorial. "Would you like to take it for a drive?" she asked softly. Silas's eyes widened, a flicker of the boy he once was returning to them. He nodded, and Ilara watched as he climbed into the cab. He looked like a small child in a giant's seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes closed. He looked at peace. The moment the engine started, Silas's eyes opened, and a single tear traced a path through a deep wrinkle on his cheek. The sound was a ghost from his past, a sound he hadn't heard in 50 years. He let his hands fall from the wheel and simply listened, his breath catching in his throat. Ilara climbed into the passenger seat, the old canvas smelling new and clean. Silas eased the truck out of the driveway and onto the dirt road. The vehicle rumbled beneath them, a familiar, comforting tremor that sent shivers down Silas's spine. It feels just like it did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way the steering wheel vibrates, the way the seat creaks. I remember every single detail. We drove this truck all over, delivering supplies to the guys in the field. Every time we went out, it was a gamble. You never knew if you were coming back. But this truck always felt safe. It was home." He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with the gratitude she couldn't fully comprehend. "Mike and I, we were inseparable. We signed up together, went through basic together. We were just two kids from Kentucky, trying to do our part. We promised we'd get back home and go fishing. We had this secret spot, right by this little creek. He had a picture of it, and he kept it right here," he said, pointing to the now empty glove compartment. "We'd look at it and dream about it." A profound silence settled between them, broken only by the low rumble of the engine. Silas drove slowly, his hands light on the wheel, as if he was afraid to break the spell. He was no longer on a quiet country road. He was back in a hot, humid jungle, the truck a lifeline, the world a blur of green and noise and fear. He remembered the last time he'd seen Mike, a moment frozen in time. They were unloading supplies, and a sudden, terrible sound had torn through the air. Mike had been laughing just a moment before. Silas had jumped into the back of the truck, the very place he was looking at now. "I still feel like I should have done something," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have been faster. I should have." Ilara reached over and gently placed a hand on his arm. "You did everything you could, Silas," she said softly. "You survived, and you remembered." He nodded, a long, deep sigh escaping his lips. "I remembered," he said, as if the words themselves were a revelation. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, a vacuum where the deep rumble had been. He sat for a moment, his head resting against the back of the seat, his eyes closed. When he opened them, the raw grief was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. "Thank you, Ilara," he said. "You didn't just restore a truck. You brought a piece of my life back to me. A piece I thought was gone forever." That day, the woods around the barn heard the roar of a diesel engine once more, a sound that had been silent for half a century, and for Ilara, the sound was sweeter than any music, a song of remembrance and hope. She had given the truck back its soul, and in doing so, she had given a piece of one man's heart back to him. The two of them, the restorer and the veteran, stood together, as the sun set, watching the last golden rays fall on the gleaming olive, drab of a machine that was no longer just a truck, but a home for a cherished memory.